Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. For those who are joining us from Europe, I don't know if there are colleagues from the US or Australia or anywhere in the world. Happy New Year to all of you. This is our first IC Ethics meeting room for 2025, and it is a great pleasure for me to introduce our previous IC Ethics chair, Dr. Kathrin Pabst, who is a German ethnologist, and she's an independent researcher. And she's going to present to us today a very important topic, which is about personal strain when working with emotionally charged topics in a professional museum setting. So I would like to give the floor to you, Kathrin. And thank you for agreeing to accept this first invitation and for the many ideas that we share together, and for being a very loyal member to IC Ethics. Thank you. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Lina, and welcome to all of you. It's really a pleasure to be here. I am going to talk about something which I have worked with in almost 20 years and which is very, for me, one of the most important topics in the museum field. And I just want to say, I don't know if you have read the introduction about my background. I'm also a member of ETHCOM, the standing committee of ICOM, but I'm not representing ETHCOM right now. I'm presenting research results from over 20 years of my career. So I will see if I can share my screen with you. I hope everyone can see it, the main page now. Yeah, Lina, I can see that you are nodding. So we called this speech, or I called this speech, I won't be able to say much more or much longer, because of a conference which I was invited to very kindly by IC Ethics, ETHCOM, ICOM Armenia, and also the Armenian Museum of History in Yerevan. This happened just 6 weeks ago, 2 months ago, approximately. And for those who haven't been in Armenia, I haven't been there before, this was one of the most impressive visits to a country I have ever had. Here you have a country which have experienced a genocide just 100 years ago. You have a country that have been in war 4 years ago and lost over 5,000 young men. And this country invited professionals from all over the world to a conference about professionalism and ethics in challenging times. Basically, when war might come up again as a very important topic, but also in a country where trauma, individual and collective trauma, is very much present in several layers in the society. I presented in this, and also resilience. I have to say this is a very impressive experience to be in Armenia because of its history and how the people of Armenia cope with their history. After this conference, and I presented some of the topics I will present to you in a minute, one of the women rose in the, stood up in the audience, and she said, I'm working with something similar. I'm working with trauma, and I don't think I can cope much longer. And I have experienced and heard this very, very many times during my career from people who work with difficult, emotionally charged topics. But this was so clear that, again, we had a woman here who was so much wanting to do a good job for a profession she loved, but it just costs so much that resignation is for many even a possibility. So this is something of that what I would like to talk to you about. I would like to start with very shortly saying a little bit more about my background, what I'm basing my, one of the projects I'm basing my recommendations on. This was the international European project called Identity on the Line from 2019 to 23. And 7 European countries, only European countries, collaborated. You see the projects here. And they wanted to know a little bit more about if there have been collective trauma in a country, in this case, war and forced migration, and the generation who have experienced very difficult experiences is not able or does not want to share what has happened with kids and grandchildren. How does this affect not only themselves, because they keep quiet about something which was really important for them, but how does this also affect their children and grandchildren, and in addition, the whole society, because there is something under the surface which is related to very strong emotions in humans, in individuals, in families, in societies, but it doesn't come to the surface. So how will these, sorry, I just have to get all the faces of us a little bit out of my screen. How can we relieve, in a way, the personal experiences that has not been shared before? And can museums contribute to heal trauma in these settings? I will come back to that, but I will not go in depth about the question, how good can museums do by this work? Because they can do unbelievably much good and they can contribute to healing. But today I want to concentrate on what does it do with the museum professionals who are doing this job, who are working with unresolved trauma, who are working with unresolved emotions in informants and in visitors. Here you can see we have worked in 7 countries. As I said, we have conducted 164 in-depth interviews with 3 generations of people who have experienced war and forced migration and their descendants. We have all used the same interview guides in all 7 countries. We have worked on this interview guides with psychologists, and we have had an analysis of all interviews under the same conditions. So we have done as good as we could to find out as much as possible about how trauma is transferred from one generation to the other, how individual trauma is related to collective trauma. Very, very short, I don't want to talk much about our definitions, but you have emotions and you have feelings. I'm talking about emotionally charged topics. Of course, they are very much related to feelings, but emotions are even more raw, okay? Your emotions is nothing. You think a little bit about it and then you have a reaction, but it comes suddenly and it can be triggered by something you didn't even know you have. And what I'm going to talk today mainly about is, if we work with emotionally charged topics, we museum professionals are very much focused on the people we work with and very little on ourselves. Just 3 short examples, very, very short quotes of unbelievable huge material, you know, from the project Identity on the Line. And if you read this quote, you can see already, or you get already an impression how difficult it must have been for my colleagues, in this case from Lithuania, to talk to people who have experienced or who have survived the Holocaust, women who are now over 100 years old, and for the first time talk to their daughter in this case and listen to stories about what trauma did in the family, and without anyone talking about this. Here you have a story from Norway. The Germans have, okay, I don't go in this history of all the projects we have worked on, but basically a lot of people feel on the outside of society, and when museum professionals come to them, or museum professionals present a research project or documentary project about a certain time in history where difficult collective changes have taken place. Many people have been during that time in an outsider position and share now for the first time with the museum professionals what they have experienced. Meaning that there are raw emotions coming out because they have never shared the story before. Here you have a grandchild of someone who supported the Germans who have occupied Norway, so were one of the bad guys, and how this not knowing suddenly can get almost an explosion of emotions when you finally get some information or talk to a museum professional for the first time about what you have experienced. So very strong powers are in place here. So I could say a lot about what is happening about the generations, but basically it is about emotions. It's about silence and the untold, meaning that we have so many people in our societies. And as you know, museums are serving societies. We as museum professionals want to contribute to as much as we can to help these societies. And we want sometimes to relieve the untold, which has been there. Many know about it, many doesn't know anything about it, and it would be important for the society as such to know more about what the first generation has experienced firsthand, for example, during war. The second generation doesn't get the information from their parents. There is often silence between these two generations. And there is also silence between these three generations, because even the third generation can feel that something happened in their families or in the societies. But as nobody breaks the silence, nobody really knows what it is. But you can feel a kind of heaviness. You can feel a kind of, how can I say it? Not negativity, but there is something which would be really crucial for you to know, but you don't know what it is. And to release this untold, museums can do really a great job. And one of the psychologists we have collaborated with said again and again, secrets are always more dangerous than stories, because many of my colleagues in the project ask, isn't it better not to ask too much in detail what has happened? Isn't it better to just leave it? Because we can trigger trauma, we can trigger feelings which have been suppressed for a very long time. And what if we do harm to our informants or to our visitors in the museum? And the psychologists were very clear, all of them, secrets are always more dangerous than stories. Of course, very important to approach emotionally charged topics in a very careful way. I don't want to talk too much about the definition of trauma, but it is an emotional response and it comes suddenly. And once you experience a trauma, this trauma will stay in your body until it is addressed. Some people can cope with trauma for the rest of their life by suppressing it, but approximately 2/3 are really affected by the trauma until it is treated properly. And 1/3 is even getting really, really ill of it. So different responses, but a trauma, which means you really are in fear that you will die, somebody you love will die. Massive trauma, of course, in war and forced migration is always affecting you. There are three, this is still background information. There are three theories how trauma can be transferred from one generation to the next. And I would like to share them with you, but because I think that we need this information for treating our visitors, being even more careful when talking to informants and to visitors. Three ways of transforming from or transferring from one generation to the next. The first is related to what you see and experience in the direct interaction. The second is related to you being in the warmth of your mother and getting the hormones, the stress hormones directly. And even there is a DNR component, which is quite new. This is quite new research conducted with Holocaust survivors, mainly in Israel. And as I said, the first is experience is related to experiences when you see or hear your mother or father reacting in a certain way. And the same goes for people in your society. The same goes for informants or visitors, that you can sense that there is something here which you have to be careful about, or which you should be careful to touch upon. But you have to be very focused when these are people you don't know. You get it automatically if there are people in your family, for example. The third transfer possibility, as I mentioned, has a genetic component, and that's quite new, meaning that, let's say, your grandmother or grandfather have had an extremely traumatic experience. Their DNA, you are born with the same DNA, you die with the same DNA, but which parts of your DNA is activated? That is related to several factors and aspects. And one of these aspects is trauma. So if you experience trauma, a new part of your DNA will be activated, and very often it is related to a stress in your body. So the stress in your body you experience when you experience a trauma, this activation of a part of the DNA could be found in studies even in your grandchildren. And the grandchildren do often not know what you have experienced, but they themselves can be triggered by something so strongly that they react much more stronger than they were prepared for, because they didn't know there is a trigger here. And this is the point of this talk, the same goes for you. You yourself can also be somehow related or affected by a topic you work with in a museum setting, which is related to trauma in some way or another, and you didn't even know that you were so much related to that topic. And even then you can get a very, very strong emotional reaction. And we all have to be a little bit more aware about it, and I will say some more about it. This funky picture, as we called it, showed some of the colleagues I have worked with in the project Identity on the Line. And this was a picture we did for fun, as you can see. But to be honest, to work with these topics over 4 years was very, very demanding for all of us. We had psychological help during the time. We cope different with this. And very interesting, in the beginning of the project, I asked my colleagues from these 7 European countries, and I said, who of you have somehow this topic, war and forced migration, in your own family? And all except one raised their hands. So all of them were also voluntarily applying for this project and contributing to the project because they knew how important it is, and they knew somehow it is related to me, but they didn't know how. There are very often information missing, but very often museum professionals working with emotionally charged topics willingly have somehow their own relation to this topic, and often they don't know it, but for them it's even more difficult to work with this. Please excuse my not very professional paintings here, which is not paintings, but just pictures and some drawings from the internet. For me, I always try to imagine us in the middle. This are we, the person here, the museum professional, somebody in the middle of a private sphere. Let's say we talk to informants who want to be anonymous. We conduct interviews, we work in archives, and we find stories which haven't been told yet, but which we want to somehow give to a public sphere, to visitors, through exhibitions. We want to somebody to read our publications, because we think that is very important information in the experiences of the people here, and we want to somehow transform it or be a kind of moderator to give stories which have been in the dark, which are very sensitive and wouldn't be shared willingly by the people here. We want to share them in an ethical, good way with the public sphere. And how do we do it? So we are in direct contact with people who, in this case, in my case, have experienced something traumatic. And we are in direct contact with the visitors, and we get the emotions from both parts. And we forget that we in the middle, we, the transformators and the moderators, have emotions often related to the topic, or at least related to our relations to the people from the private sphere and the visitors or readers in the public sphere, which really affect us in a heavy way. So some takeaways from former research, and this is not only from Identity on the Line, but also other projects I have conducted, working with emotionally charged topics. Always, I will be so strong and say always, lead to reactions, especially when traumatic memories are involved. And you do not always know in advance when this will happen. The reactions, if you interview someone, or of visitors when they come to your, when they read your books, or they come to your exhibitions, where new information about a sensitive, emotionally charged topic is presented, can have very strong physical and mental reactions. And you in the middle, you, the transformator and the moderator, you often feel somehow responsible for these reactions, and you go so far you can go to spare your informants and the public or your visitors for too heavy emotional reactions. So you really work, you go above and beyond to take care of these, and you often forget yourself. I will also go so far to say that we lack theoretical knowledge about trauma transfer and what emotions can lead to in our informants and in our visitors, and we do not have the adequate training very often. And as you see here in my last point, we working with these topics do often not know or underestimate that we ourselves, as often as members of the society we are researching in or we are documenting certain topics of, are a part of this society, and sometimes there are also collective traumas which affect us even if we don't have anything in our families. Very short, I just want a little sidestep and be a little bit personal. After working with Identity on the Line and working my way through all this not talking in 3 generations, I had a closer look at my own family history, and I found information about my family I have never heard about, which affected me so profoundly that I, as a researcher and a writer, worked my way through this new knowledge, which I suddenly heard about for the very first time, found in archives. My mother, who was a little child during the war, doesn't remember anything, but it was a traumatic experiences for over 1 year, with everything from rape and hunger and illness and everything you can imagine of bad things. I worked my way through my family history without any help of my grandparents, which I love deeply, which were dead already then. And it took the last bit of my energy. If I had already been very, very tired after Identity on the Line, mainly because it is so tough for us museum professionals, I want to say it like that, if we really think it's important to release some emotionally charged topics, but we just have to find out while we go how to do so. And we have this first-hand experiences with informants who have never shared their story before, now are willing to share it with museum employees. And then we want to take care of the visitors who should learn something about something they didn't know, but not be affected in a too negative way or even re-traumatized. So I was tired from before, but this really was too much, because these were people I love. These are people, this is my family. Okay, so what are the health risks? If I sum up, what are the health risks? And now I'm of course not talking about myself. I'm talking about all the colleagues I have worked with. I'm talking about several research projects about what happens if you are, as a museum professional, digging into topics which are emotionally charged but not shared yet with a society or with your visitors, which are quite new for the first time they come to the surface. So the health risks are related, in my experience, to not knowing that you are personally affected, because suddenly you can have a very strong reaction to something you work with and you don't even understand why. You underestimate personal drain. You underestimate how much time it takes and how difficult it might be to work with the informants and the visitors. You overestimate your own capabilities to cope with trauma. And several of my colleagues during the years have been affected by secondary traumatization, meaning that you have heard so many traumatic stories without sharing them yourself with anyone, but you work your way through, and you think, I can cope because it's not my trauma. But if you listen to enough traumas over too long time, you can really end up with what psychologists call is secondary traumatization. I have not met one museum professional working in this, really engaging this in these kind of topics they think are important to share and to bring to the surface of society, which were able to step down. So even when they stopped sleeping at night, even when it really became difficult to combine the life as a mother or father with the work, when they saw that they got more and more depressed, when they stepped down from social activities, when they worked 12 to 14 hours a day to somehow take care of the informants and of the visitors, even then they were not able to step down because they were so convinced this is important to work with and didn't take care of themselves. Also, in many cases, it's really very sad to say, but in many cases, the colleagues or the leaders do not understand what you're going through, especially not if they themselves do not work with the same topics. And often you're quite alone doing so. There are not many people working on emotionally charged topics at the same time in an institution. So sometimes you do not have the right working conditions, but at least you very seldom have proper understanding and adequate support. I come back to that. And the personal and professional consequences can be sick leaves, burnout, and even resignation. So I know some highly, highly educated museum professionals who have quit working in museums after these kind of projects because they said, I couldn't do it anymore. I took it too far. I just couldn't do it anymore. Some of them come back after a few years of quietness, but we really have to be more careful here. So what might be the coping strategies? Awareness is, of course, the very first. You have to think when working with emotionally charged topics, which mechanisms can be at play. I have only talked a little bit about them, but there is much more knowledge to get, of course. It's very important to take yourself so seriously that you think about self-care. And you need, and this was also one important aspect in my talk in Armenia, you have to do in advance a realistic analysis of your working conditions. And with that, I mean that if you, as a researcher or somebody who is working with exhibitions, come across emotionally charged topic you think is very important to work with, you think would really contribute, the people in your region, the people in your society, your visitors, okay? If you come across such a topic and you want to start your work, please stop a little second and see around you and just try to figure out, is my boss supporting me? Do I have colleagues who would understand if I need more time to work on this? Do I have a husband and a family who will can cope with me really getting all into it? And how can I take care of myself? If you do not have working conditions, if you have a boss who doesn't understand why working with emotions might be somehow difficult, if you don't have colleagues who think that museums should work with something like that, I would rather say don't do it, because you would be too alone and it will be too demanding. So what can the working place do? If you have one of the good museum leaders and one of the museums which really work with the difficult topics and know how to really support their employees in a good way, that would mean that not only there is an awareness in the institution, how much time it takes and how much energy it takes to work with emotionally charged topics. Some institution might even give you access to a psychologist. Yes, please say yes if they have the possibility. And self-care practices. They would provide or at least get in touch with researchers who can provide theoretical knowledge and practical training in how to conduct the interviews, how to work with the people, informants who have experienced something traumatic. And what I believe is maybe one of the most important things to work more with, the question how peer support and one-to-one mentoring by museum professionals mentoring museum professionals, how that could support to work more with this. Because I really strongly believe that working with emotionally charged topics and somehow contributing to more healthy families and societies is a very important part of our museums. One of the most important things we can do. I really believe that in the service of society. And then I want to draw your attention to a very interesting talk, which I heard on the 2nd of September in the ICOM Netherlands, in an ICOM Netherlands event. It was by Abir Eladani, and she talked about emotional tax, or what you have to pay when you can see here the definition which she draw up. This is a screenshot, as you can see, how emotionally difficult it is as a museum professional to be one of the few with a certain gender, with a certain race, a certain ethnicity, and that it costs a lot of power and energy only to be somehow different in a museum setting where they are then. And she said there are professional support groups. You see it here on the left side. These are also screenshots. And is very clear about that creating a culture of self-care is very important here. And of course, there are differences between what we talked about, but both is related to emotions. In one case, who you are as a museum worker. In my case, also, or what you're affected by. And also in my case, or in my talk, you're affected by individual and collective trauma, which you might feel, which you are really triggered by, but you do not know, in my case, not necessary that this is the case. But in any way, it is related to emotions. And we very much do agree upon that you have to think about self-care and awareness as first top priorities. So I have 5 books. There are many, many more books I just wanted to share with you, because a lot is written about care ethics and also about care ethics for cultural workers. So what I told you today were a lot of personal reflections and projects, but there are written quite a lot of books about the same topics in a way that it is a known, not necessarily with the individual and collective trauma and what it three-generational perspective and what it does to you, but how can you take care of yourself when working with emotionally charged topics. So maybe it's an idea for those of you who are interested to have a closer look to one of the books. And I want to end with a result of the conference I started with, the Armenian conference, when we had a talk afterwards. Lina Tahan, the chair of ICE Ethics, Andrea, the secretary, and myself in the hotel lobby in the evening. And we were talking about not only what we had heard in the audience, but also that we know so many people in so many countries of our colleagues, museum professionals, no matter which museum, no matter which country, when you work with these kind of topics, emotionally charged topics, what does it do to you and how much it drains you and how little information is really in the museums about this and among us museums professionals right now. So we decided to start a new project calling Reducing Personal Drain through Peer Mentoring and Supervision, to try to work out, is there any possibility that museum professionals who have already some experience, like myself, for example, can mentor other museum professionals, which then can mentor other museum professionals in what experience we have done, how to take care of yourself, how to accept the possibilities to get help or training, knowledge transfer, which are there already. And this project, we wanted to start with a meeting room event like this one. We want to talk and interview these museum colleagues I was talking about. And if you yourself should be one of them, you're very much welcome to contact us. And if you would yourself like to contribute to that, and conduct in-depth interviews to find even more details about what do you need when you're in a situation where you work with emotionally charged topics. What I presented to you, trauma, individual and collective trauma, is maybe only one of several emotionally difficult, sorry, my English is not always the best, difficult topics. And Abir has talked, as you saw in the screenshots, she also talked about one very important aspect here. So what are your experiences? How can we check or maybe find out more about them, gather more experiences, a broader spectrum, and also develop programs to increase the knowledge and competencies for handling emotionally demanding topics? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Kathrin, for this wonderful presentation. Really, truly enlightening, because trauma can also affect our mental health, not only our physical health. And you mentioned the word resilience at the beginning. So we really need to be resilient people to work with such topics, because we, although we are museum professionals, but each one of us has a background. We all have experienced certain traumatic events. You know, I am one of them. I'm a child of war. And when I came to work on Lebanese museums, I have seen some of the things you have discussed. So I've experienced it. I'm sure there are people in the audience who, as well, we have Teresine, who worked at the Anne Frank Museum. You know, she has an in-depth look at Anne Frank and what she has experienced herself. I'm happy to announce that Abir is with us as well today. So she has listened to your talk. And I don't want to delay, but I would like to open the floor to everyone who has a question to Kathrin, or who has experienced something similar to what she has experienced as a researcher. So please.
And
Lina, maybe we can turn off the recording now.
exactly. Yeah, that's what I wanted to say.